Okay, it's 9:45. Good to see you guys back. Open your Bibles, please, to Luke 20. We'll get there eventually. I've got a lot of things to say before then, but that's going to be the parallel passage to Matthew 22. It's going to be Luke 20. You know, Tuesday of the final week of Jesus' life, that Tuesday is when the confrontation between Jesus and the religious leaders reaches its peak. They would love to arrest Jesus. They would love to kill Jesus, but they can't because Jesus is too popular with the people, and if they try to arrest him, there might be a riot, and if there's a riot, Rome will put a stop to it, and they'll get in trouble with Rome. So the religious leaders, I think, are feeling a little bit trapped. And because they're feeling trapped, like their hands are tied, they decide what we need to do is trap Jesus instead. Move the trap off of ourselves, see if we can tie Jesus' hands, get him to incriminate himself by basically trapping him in his own words. So they try to trick Jesus into saying something that will either destroy his credibility among the Jews or get him in trouble with the Romans. And here's the takeaway for this morning's class. That is, behind every question is a questioner. I heard this phrase in a recent interview I heard with Ravi Zacharias. If you've not heard Ravi speak, I encourage you to look him up on YouTube. That's R-A-V-I. V as in Victor, I as in India. He actually is from India. But he travels the world giving a defense for Christianity. He's just incredibly knowledgeable. But what impresses me about Ravi is how connective and personable he is, even with people who are hostile to his message. Well, the interviewer asked him why Ravi so often answers questions by asking questions in return. And, you know, the first obvious answer was, well, that's what Jesus did. So he's trying to model Jesus with that. But another one of the reasons he gave was that behind every question is a questioner. In other words, questions are rarely random. There's a real human being with a real reason for asking the questions they ask. And when we ask questions in return, like Jesus did, we actually expose the questioner behind the question. We expose their motives, their assumptions. It also helps us determine the entry point for a conversation. Ravi told of a time early in his life. He was a preacher for a church, and he had overheard some of the members asking the question, you know, why does God allow suffering? And his initial reaction was, well, I'm just going to launch into this treatise on the problem of pain. But then he looked behind them and he noticed on the pew there was their baby, and their baby was badly deformed. And he realized this question they're asking is not a philosophical one. It's a felt need. There were questioners, real human beings, behind that question. I think that's a helpful lesson to remember. And sadly, we're going to see the dark side of this principle in our class this morning. We're going to see that behind these questions by the Pharisees and Sadducees were very evil and twisted questioners. And the way Jesus responds with questions of his own, it'll expose the hearts of these questioners for who they really are. And in their case, it will expose that there actually is no entry point for conversation because they are too hard-hearted. They don't really care about the answers to these questions. All they care about is humiliating Jesus. So in Luke 20, we're going to have the first question about paying taxes to Caesar. But before we actually do that, let's go to our Father in prayer. God in heaven, we're grateful to be here this morning to gather together here with the small group at the building, but to be with our families and to be able to join in virtually and to open your word together and to study it. We're so humbled by Jesus and his brilliance, and we pray, God, that you'll help us to have more admiration, more faith in our Lord as a result of this class, and that we'll draw closer to you. And we'll develop an even deeper love for your word that will continue to grow in our hearts, and we'll continue to read and study and diligently know your word so that we can come to know the author. Thank you so much for this opportunity. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. All right, so in Luke 20, let's go ahead and read verses 19 through 26. The scribes and the chief priests tried to lay hands on him that very hour, but they feared the people, for they understood that he spoke this parable against them. So they watched him and sent spies who pretended to be righteous in order that they might catch him in some statement, so that they could deliver him to the rule and the authority of the governor. And they questioned him, saying, "Teacher, We know that you speak and teach correctly, and you are not partial to any, but teach the way of God in truth. Is it lawful for us to pay taxes to Caesar or not?" But he detected their trickery, and he said to them, "Show me a denarius. Whose likeness and inscription does it have?" And they said, "Caesar's." And he said to them, "Then render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's." And they were unable to catch him in a saying in the presence of the people, and being amazed at his answer, they became silent. Now, I'm going to break this section down, but before I do, here's the question I plan to ask at the end of this section. And you can text that in to my phone, and you can be thinking about that while we're talking about this section. Or if you feel like you already know the answer to this, you can go ahead and text that in, and I'll be able to get to those whenever we're finished breaking this section down. But the question is, what was so brilliant about Jesus' answer in verses 24 and 25, his response there? That'll continue to be up on the screen as we go through this. Well, already we see the twisted motives of the questioners behind the question. The Pharisees sent these men as spies to pretend to be righteous, to pretend to be honest seekers of the truth. They even paid Jesus compliments, almost to butter him up and to get him to let his guard down. If Jesus thinks it's a trap, well, he'll be much more cautious about his answers. But if they can get him to relax and think, hey, this is just a friendly conversation, he might not think through his answer as carefully. And isn't it true that some people even today ask questions about God or the Bible, pretending as if they're actually interested in the answers, when in reality they're just trying to poke holes in Christianity? Or they're trying to trap us in saying, or in a question that we can't answer, or in saying something foolish to make us look bad. Sadly, that still happens today. And unfortunately, we don't really know people's motives all the time behind their questions. So sometimes we can ask them questions that will expose their motives. Some good questions to do that might be, hey, good question. If I give you a satisfactory answer, would you consider believing in God? Or, hey, good question. Why do you ask that? Those are good ways to help expose the motives when we're unsure. Well, Jesus was not unsure. Verse 23 says he detected their trickery. And before we get into his answer, let's talk about why this was such a tricky question and why it would have been a potentially serious trap if Jesus didn't give the right answer. It's actually really deep and diabolical and brilliant, this trap that they lay for Jesus. And I think any human being, any normal human being, would have absolutely crumbled under the pressure and the weight of this question. Well, in order to understand this, we need to know, starting in the year 6 AD, the Roman Empire began levying a yearly tax on all their subjects. That's why Joseph and Mary in Luke chapter 2 have to return to their hometown for a census, because it was that census that was going to be the basis for determining who all would be subject to that taxation. Well, the Jews were not happy about this. In fact, they hated it. And of course, everybody hates taxes, right? Nobody likes to pay taxes, but it was worse for the Jews for a few reasons. Number one, it would have reminded them of their subjugation as a people under Rome, that they didn't have their freedom. They weren't a nation like on top of the world like they were in David and Solomon's day, back in the glory days. So that would have been a difficult reminder. Also, Romans were pagans, and the Jews couldn't stand the fact that they might be financially supporting a pagan nation who probably were definitely doing sinful things, but were probably even doing sinful things with the tax money that they would get. And thirdly, Romans viewed their emperors as divine. In fact, the coin Jesus asked for is a denarius. It's a day's wage. And on one side of the coin was a picture of Tiberius Caesar. You can see that on the left side here with the inscription, Tiberius Caesar, Tiberius Caesar of the divine Augustus. He was Augustus Caesar's son. Augustus viewed as divine, and so was Tiberius because he was the son of the divine Augustus. And on the other side was Tiberius's mother, Livia. And she was actually posing like the Roman goddess of peace. And there's an inscription there that means high priest. So the Romans viewed Tiberius Caesar as son of the divine Caesar Augustus and a high priest to the goddess of peace. So if the Jews are paying money to the emperor, it would be really hard for them not to feel like maybe we're sending our money to support a false god and pay tribute to an idol. Interestingly, in Acts 5, when Gamaliel stands up and he gives kind of a history lesson to the Sanhedrin Council, he mentions this. In Acts 5, verse 37, after this man, Judas of Galilee rose up in the days of the census and drew away some people after him, and he too perished, and all those who followed him were scattered. This is actually a reference back to 6 AD. And it wasn't just that Judas was opposed to taking a census. He was opposed to the taxation. He hated it so much that he revolted against Rome. He rebelled against the Romans. So I want you to see that this question, do we pay tribute to Caesar, was a hot button issue of the day. It was a political issue, it was a religious issue, and it was an emotional issue, tied not only to the consciences of Jews, but tied to Jewish history with Judas and that rebellion. And it was designed to trap Jesus no matter what answer he gave. If Jesus says, no, we don't have to pay taxes to Caesar, well then he's going to be in trouble with Rome. He's going to be treated like an insurrectionist the way Judas of Galilee was treated. And if he says, on the other hand, yes, we should pay taxes to Caesar, well then he's going to make a lot of the Jews angry because it sounds like Jesus is okay with honoring Caesar as a god. And not only that, but remember, the Jews thought the Messiah was coming to save them from the Roman rule, to put the Romans under the Jews' feet so that the Romans will have to pay taxes to the Jews. So if Jesus says, yes, we pay taxes to Caesar, now he's shattering all of their messianic expectations, and he's going to lose popularity with the people. So with that understanding of just how diabolically treacherous this trap really was, what was so brilliant about the way Jesus answered this? Verses 24 and 25, and I'm already getting some text in here. Okay, Jay Rimmer says he asked them a question before providing an answer to their first one, and that threw them off guard, which is what they were trying to do to him. Yes, very good. I'm going to say something about that. Let me read some other ones first. Emery, it's actually a good question. It shows the separation between the spiritual soul and physical body and subjugation to authority under each. Yeah, absolutely. Debbie Roschecker says something similar. He separates the physical from the spiritual. Yeah, there's honoring God and there's honoring Caesar, and those two things are not necessarily synonymous. Yeah, really good. So Terry Petty says they ask a divisive question, and Jesus' answer was a unifying answer. Yeah, really good. It would have actually helped people understand this issue a little bit better. Chloe says it was brilliant because it acknowledged Rome's control over the people, so it doesn't undermine the earthly authority of the time. Also, it shows that while Rome is in charge, you must also give to God because he is the true ruler. It's probably also stated, render to Caesar what is his, so that the Jews can't argue God's son told us not to, and we need to listen to him, and Jesus can't be charged with starting a rebellion or revolt. Yeah, really good stuff, Chloe. Absolutely, all these comments are just excellent, just so helpful. Let me read one more here. Jesus separated, material world from the spiritual world. Yeah, exactly. Let me expand on your comments, actually, because they're really, really helpful. So to this point of what Jay said about how he asks them a question that kind of catches them off guard. I think there's significance when he says, show me a denarius whose inscription is on this piece. I think what that does, it does a couple things. First, it exposes the hypocrisy of the Jews who have no problem using Caesar's money to buy things and to conduct their business. but they have a problem paying some of that money back to Caesar. You know, when Jesus says, show me a denarius, he knew one of them would have one, because that's some of the money that the Jews used to conduct their lives and their business. So Caesar has actually provided them with money with which to make a living, and he's built roads to promote trade, and he pays soldiers to keep peace, and all of that benefits the Jews as well. But they don't want to pay Caesar anything back for his provisions. That's a little selfish and hypocritical. If you're fine using Caesar's money for your own gain and your own benefit in your life, but you don't want to pay him any of that back. I think that would have been part of what he said. You guys are dead on with your spiritual versus physical thing. Jesus clearly separates Caesar and God here. He makes absolutely no indication that paying taxes is honoring Caesar as God or honoring him as divine. He separates and says Caesar and God, two very, very separate beings here. And thirdly, this is what many times happens when people ask questions. Many questions are based on an either-or fallacy. You know, you either pay taxes to Caesar or you honor God. And what Jesus does is he changes their thinking, and he says, actually, this is not an either-or situation. It's a both-and situation. That God still deserves to be honored, because as Chloe said, he's the true ruler. But it's Caesar's picture on that money. He has the authority in the land, and he has played a role in making money available to them and building a society where even the Jews could flourish. It only makes sense to pay Caesar to contribute to the continuation of that kind of flourishing society. And notice the New Testament actually speaks to this concept. Later in Romans 13:1, every person is to be in subjection to the governing authorities. For there is no authority except from God, and those which exist are established by God. He even says later in verse 4, God sets up governments for our good, for our benefit. And here what we see is the both and concept. That by honoring the governing authorities and following their laws, we actually are honoring God. Because God is the one who put those governments there for our good. Later in this chapter, Romans 13:7, Paul gets even more specific. Render to all what is due them, tax to whom tax is due, custom to whom custom, fear to whom fear, honor to whom honor. Now let's think about this ourselves for a second, because we might even find ourselves in a pickle today as Christians. Because we're not exactly supporting a Christian government with our taxes, are we? And isn't it true that sometimes the government uses tax money for sinful purposes? What do? Do we pay taxes or do we honor God? Jesus says both. Both. We pay taxes anyway. We are not to blame if the government chooses to use that money in sinful ways. Now in America, we actually have the privilege of voting, and we can try to make some change in the government, and that's a helpful thing. But ultimately, if the government decides to use that money sinfully, God's going to judge them for that. And we also don't want to take the sinful attitude that says the government's not taking my money. I worked for this money, and they are not going to put their paws on it. Look, no one likes paying taxes. This is tax week. It's April 15th. Is tax week. So this is maybe especially sore for us right now as a subject. But we need to understand the government plays a role in creating a society that makes it possible for us to make money. They use money to build roads, to pay police officers and firefighters, to keep us safe, to pay teachers, to give us educations, to fund organizations like the CDC, which sometimes really drops the ball on things, but we also still need them to be working on vaccines when we have viral outbreaks. So we may not like paying taxes, and I'll say we may have different philosophies on how much the government should tax us, but our government is still due their honor. And when we pay them that honor, by paying taxes, we actually honor God who allows them to rule for our benefit. And man, in Luke 20, that last verse, they're amazed at his answer. They become silent. It really was the perfect answer. And any normal human being would have been trapped But Jesus, our Master, He cuts right through their feeble attempt to humiliate them, and He ends up humiliating them in return. Behind every question is a questioner. And when these questioners realized their question failed to accomplish the desired result, they had nothing left to say. Completely shut down. Well, I'll ask Tim and Adam if they have any comments on that section. I really appreciate the texts that have been sent in. But Tim and Adam, do y'all have anything you want to add to that section?
I thought the way they spent the taxes in the first century to build colosseums to kill Christians, and those Christians were in a situation where they paid taxes that eventually led to their own death. And I also thought about the first part of the question that you brought up. It reminded me of Jesus. By what authority? When they came to by what authority? He flipped it on them too. He asked a question. You see that technique?
Yeah. Tim makes a good point. And we have Tim and Adam seated further back in the auditorium underneath the hanging mics, so you all should from home be able to hear their comments better. But just in case, Tim made a great point that the Christians were paying taxes to Rome, and Rome turned around and built colosseums in which they put Christians to death. That, you talk about a difficult situation there. Paying taxes actually, in some ways, led to their persecution. Got a text from Brian Strayer, said the inscription on the coin showed what belongs to Rome, while the inscription on our hearts shows what belongs to God. That is interesting. I don't know how far I want to go there and take this, but some have made the point that that coin is made in the image of Caesar, but we are made in the image of God. God's image is stamped on our hearts. So, we can use Caesar's coin with his image on it to honor him, but then we use our bodies and give our bodies a sacrifice to God. I'm not sure how strong that point is really being made in the text, if that's really even Jesus' point, but some commentators actually have pointed that out. Just interesting to think about, but I am careful not to make points the text isn't really trying to make. Adam, did you have something? Okay. All right, thanks so much for all that good participation on that section. Well, next up, the Sadducees. The Sadducees, they're basically going to ask Jesus, wouldn't a woman with 7 husbands disprove the resurrection? And here's a question that I'm going to ask a little bit later once we go through this section. And man, Adam and I, one of the things we both acknowledge is that the hardest thing about teaching these classes is coming up with questions that are not too easy and questions that are not too hard. Because if they're too easy, who's the greatest character in the Bible? Jesus. Like, okay, great. Like, nobody's going to text that in because it's almost a waste, right? But then if we, ask a super hard question, then nobody's going to be able to answer that either, and we're going to be standing up here awkwardly. I say that because I'm a little worried this might be this is going to be on the difficult side, but I really think probably some people will be able to come up with something, but we'll see. What are some modern day arguments that people make against God or Christianity that are built on false premises? What are some arguments people make against God or Christianity that are built on false premises? So we're going to discuss that, but I want to go through this section first. So let's talk about the Sadducees. We don't know a whole lot about the Sadducees. We know what they believed, but we don't really know how they came to hold their beliefs. It's one of the things that drives me crazy. I just wish we had more historical information because it's a real head scratcher for me. But in Acts chapter 23 and verse 8, we actually have Scripture's commentary on their belief. In Acts 23 and verse 8, the Sadducees say that there is no resurrection, nor an angel, nor a spirit, but the Pharisees acknowledge them all. They were basically the materialists of their day. They believe, all there is matter, and once we die, we're just worm food. Our souls don't go to heaven or hell. We are just dead. Well, look in Luke 20, verse 27. There came to him some of the Sadducees who say that there is no resurrection. The whole concept of resurrection is that one day our bodies will be raised from the grave and will be transformed, and the righteous will go to heaven, the wicked will be lost in hell. They denied that whole concept. And what drives me crazy is that we don't really know how in the world they came to believe those things, especially being Jews. But what we do know is that they held the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, sometimes called the Law of Moses, the first 5 books. They held those in the highest regard. It's not necessarily that they didn't think the rest of the Old Testament was inspired, but they just gave more weight to these first 5 books. And again, I don't understand why. I wish I knew why they gave more credence to those books. But they did. They held the first 5 books in highest esteem. We know that from secular history. Josephus, a Jewish historian, wrote some about the Sadducees there. But because they believe in those first 5 books, the Pentateuch, they come to Jesus with the book of Deuteronomy, a book from the Pentateuch, to disprove that there will ever be a resurrection to heaven once we die. So look what they say in verse 28. They question him, saying, "Teacher, Moses wrote for us that if a man's brother dies, having a wife, and he is childless, his brother should marry the wife and raise up children to his brother." So this is basically a summary of Deuteronomy 25:5, and it's sometimes referred to as the Levirate law because the word lever in Latin means brother-in-law. May seem strange to us, this custom, but here is the point of that law. The point of that law is actually given in the very next verse, in Deuteronomy 25, verse 6. "It shall be that the firstborn whom she bears shall assume the name of his dead brother, so that his name will not be blotted out from Israel." If your brother was married to a woman and died before he could bear any children with her, that means your brother's name would die with him. So you, as the brother-in-law to this woman, would have a responsibility to marry her and to have kids with her so that your brother's name would continue on and the family's land inheritance could be passed on to the next generation. Now, again, we think that's kind of weird. I want you to know this was not forced on you, right? So if your brother who's married to a woman dies, it wasn't like you're forced, you absolutely have to marry her or you're going to be lost eternally. You actually could opt out from this. It's just opting out was a shameful thing in their culture. In fact, you'll recall this is what happened in the book of Ruth. The reason Boaz married Ruth was because Ruth's husband had died and her husband's nearest kinsman would not marry her. Deuteronomy 25, continuing in verses 9 and 10, talk about the consequences of what would happen if you refused. And this, again, this almost sounds a little bit humorous, but it would have been very harsh in their culture. So Deuteronomy 25, 9 and 10, "His brother's wife shall come to him in the sight of the elders and pull his sandal off his foot and spit in his face. And she shall declare, thus it is done to the man who does not build up his brother's house. And in Israel his name shall be called the house of him whose sandal is removed." So remember from our Lord's Supper talk, names oftentimes they had significance. It wasn't that, he would literally, this would be his name, but this kind of description would follow him around for the rest of his life. That he's the house of the one whose sandal has been removed because he refused to help his brother. That's really how they would view it. It's not just that, well, he's shallow and he thinks the wife is not pretty and so he's not going to marry her. Maybe that's part of it, but a lot of it is he's just not honoring his brother. He should actually marry his wife to honor the brother who has died. And if he doesn't, well, there's going to be some humiliation there. So with all that background in mind, here's the scenario the Sadducees present in verse 29. Look at verse 29. "Now there were 7 brothers, and the first took a wife and died childless. And the second and the third married her, and in the same way all 7 died, leaving no children. And finally the woman died also. In the resurrection, therefore, which one's wife will she be? For all 7 had married her." So they present this case where Deuteronomy 25 has to be fulfilled 7 times, 7 different times with the same woman, so that by the time her life is over, she has had 7 husbands. Well, if there really is such a thing as a resurrection, then she's going to have 7 husbands in heaven, which would be polygamy. Or at the very least, when she gets to heaven, if not all 7 are her husbands, she's going to have to choose which of the 7 will be her husband in heaven, and that's going to be a really hard choice for her, and it's going to be kind of unfair and unjust. It's going to be a horrible position. Therefore, there must be no resurrection. That's really the underlying implication behind their question. Because behind every question is a questioner. These Sadducees have crafted an argument that they believe proves their point. But the argument is based on false premises. It's built on the false premise that we'll actually be married in heaven. And Jesus is going to talk about how that's not the case. And it's built on the false premise that the Scriptures don't teach that there is a resurrection. They absolutely do. And this is something that happens a lot with people. They craft arguments built on false premises because they haven't really thought through whether the premises matter. The thing that matters most to them is the conclusion that proves them right. As long as the conclusion proves them right, well, then it doesn't, the premises aren't all that important to think about. All these questioners care about is being right. So here's the question. Let's see how you did. I've seen some texts come through. I haven't read them yet, but I've seen my phone going off. So I think you guys are going to have some answers here. What are some arguments people make against God or Christianity that are built on false premises? Let's see here. Okay, so Mike Allen, if there was a benevolent God, he wouldn't let the innocent suffer. Yes, absolutely. That's a perfect example of a false premise, that assuming the existence of God means that nobody will suffer or that innocent people will suffer. And it's also built on the false premise that anybody is innocent. We're all sinners. So yeah, really good example. And that's a common one. Jessica Petty, a skeptic, once told me that since there's no real evidence for God and that there's no way to test for God's existence, God doesn't exist, and he refused to read evidence books. Yeah, so just that premise alone, that there's no way to actually test or examine or evidence and make a case for God, that's a false premise. There absolutely is a way to test evidence and examine so many things in this modern world, both philosophically and historically and geographically and just so many other ways. Jeff Hunt, false premise that evidence proves all life evolved, so there is no great designers. Now, the Sadducees, like our scientists, use flawed human thinking. Yeah, the Sadducees, that's what's so puzzling to me. They're Jews. They believe in God. How in the world can they be materialists? How in the world can they just hold that view? I wish I understood more, but yeah, they are kind of like the modern day atheists in that materialistic sense. Marilyn Lewis. A lot of time people will dismiss God or Christianity because they say that they could never follow a God that would let horrible things happen to good people or let people die of cancer. Yeah, absolutely. That's what Mike was saying. Yeah, that's a great thought. Rachel Welsh, man, you guys are killing it. This is great. There's so many of these. If God really loved me, he wouldn't let these bad things happen to me. Yeah, when in reality, he loves us so much that he let his own son suffer and die for us. Yeah, many of the premises behind people's arguments, they forget all about Jesus and what Jesus did for them. So yeah, really good one, Rachel. Terry Tokash, an all-knowing, loving God would never create us knowing we would turn against him, and he'd have to sacrifice his own son in hopes that we would turn back to him. Yeah. If God knew all the terrible things we would do, he would have never created us. Maybe. But there's also the possibility of love there, and love is worth it, is the idea. If God loves us, he wouldn't send anybody to hell. Really good thoughts. Really appreciate those, and there's just a lot more where that came from. And I'll just say this too, sometimes questions that people throw at us, they become so hypothetical that they reach the point of absurdity. Questions like, if God exists, can he create a rock so heavy that even he can't lift it? If he can, then he's not God, and if he can't, then he's not God. C.S. Lewis basically destroyed that a long time ago, saying that the whole question is nonsensical because it violates the laws of logic. It's God's nature. He can't violate himself. He can't violate logic. That's more illogical than the Sadducees question. But I do think their question is ridiculous because maybe if they would have used 2 husbands, it would have been a little less ridiculous. But 7, I mean, come on. What are the odds that every single one of these brothers dies before bearing her children? I mean, she may be barren and unable to bear children. I get that. But for all of them to die before she does, I'll tell you right now, if I am the 7th brother and I just watched 6 of my brothers marry this woman and die, guess who's not marrying her? This guy. You can spit in my face and slap me with a sandal. I don't care. This woman could be murdering her husband, slipping some poison in the stew. I'm not going to be victim number 7. Well, first Jesus is going to expose the false premise of their argument that we're actually married in heaven. And this is the next question I'm going to ask you guys. Why do you think there won't be marriage in heaven? Man, that's an interesting one. Why might there not be marriage in heaven? And while you're thinking about that, let's look at what Jesus says, verse 34 through 36. Jesus said to them, the sons of this age marry and are given in marriage, but those who are considered worthy to attain to that age in the resurrection from the dead neither marry nor are given in marriage, for they cannot even die anymore, because they are like angels and are sons of God, being sons of the resurrection. Interestingly, in the middle of Jesus' answer, he takes a couple of jabs at the Pharisees. The first jab is his statement, those who are considered worthy to attain to that age in the resurrection. I think the implication is these Sadducees need to take warning that they need to make sure they're actually worthy. There won't be a resurrection to righteousness for the Sadducees unless they're actually considered worthy to attain to that and believe in Jesus and all those implications that go along with that. The other jab is that he says we'll be like angels, because remember, the Sadducees don't believe in angels. Now, need to be clear there, we won't actually be angels. We'll be like them, and that will be spiritual beings. The scriptures make the point that man will actually be exalted to a position higher than the angels. So he's not saying that we will actually become angels, but that we're like them in our nature. We don't die, and we're spiritual beings. So why do you think there won't be marriage in heaven? Don't think. Oh well. Let's see. All right, Jessica Petty. It ties us to our earthly lives, and we'll be in our new heavenly bodies. God, Jesus, and the angels, are not married. Yeah, really good. Our earthly bodies have these fleshly desires that our heavenly bodies can't have. Yeah, absolutely. I think you're really dead on there, Jessica. That marriage is an earthly thing, and not a heavenly thing, and we won't be in our flesh, so we won't have those same fleshly desires for that sexual relationship. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, wow, there's a lot coming in. Okay, Jeff says we won't need a helpmeet in heaven as we do on earth. Yeah, God will be our help. He'll provide all things. In fact, the word helper, ezer, that's used for wife there in Genesis is the same word that's used of God many times in Scripture. So God will ultimately be our helper. Really good. Let's see. Rodney, in heaven, we are God's children and brothers and sisters in Christ. Yeah, absolutely. Really good thoughts. There are more there, but I have to move on for time's sake. But similar ideas. Let me say a couple more things. I'm not sure we're going to need to procreate anymore in heaven. And also, think about this. I think this is really the ultimate point. Since marriage is supposed to represent the intimacy of our relationship with God, once we have that perfectly intimate relationship with Him in heaven, we won't need marriage anymore. And this might sound a little bit rough to say for married couples, but we won't. As wonderful as marriage is, we won't even want marriage anymore because it's being replaced by a far more glorious relationship of which marriage was just a foreshadowing. So marriage is a wonderful thing. Enjoy your marriage, bask in that, but recognize how your marriage is supposed to ultimately be preparing you for heaven in your relationship with God. Which, this is just an aside, isn't it ironic that many people allow their marriages to destroy their relationship with God. It's just the opposite intention of God. Our marriages should be bringing us closer to the Lord. If it's not, as Tim says, one of us or both of us is sinning. The husband's sinning or the wife is sinning or both are sinning. If marriage is not bringing us closer to God. So anyway, that was a side point. Let me move on. Because Jesus addresses the second false premise that Scriptures don't teach anything about a resurrection. They absolutely do. And Jesus could have used a lot of passages from other places in the Bible that would have been clearer, but because he knows how highly regarded the Pentateuch is to the Sadducees, he uses the book of Exodus to make the point. He says in verse 37, "But that the dead are raised, even Moses showed," in the passage about the burning bush, where he calls the Lord the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. Now he is not the God of the dead, but of the living, for all live to him. You know, in the time of Exodus 3, when God appears to Moses in the burning bush, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob had long since been dead. Yet notice Moses still refers to God as their God. It's not that he used to be the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob back when they were alive. No, he is still their God, even though they're dead. Even in Moses' day. He's not the God of the dead. Dead people can't serve this God. Only the living can serve him. God is someone who makes covenants with people and blesses people and supplies their every need. How absurd to think that all that stops when a person dies. How absurd to think God only takes care of his people for 80 years or however long they live, and then he's not their God anymore. No. Even after Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob died, God continued to be their God. And he was going to continue providing for them and blessing them and having a relationship with them beyond the grave. And Moses recognized that, which is why he referred to God the way that he did. And again, verse 39, some of the scribes answered and said, "Teacher, you have spoken well." Verse 40, they did not have courage to question him any longer about anything. I hope we can appreciate the absolute brilliance of Jesus here. He could have used much clearer passages like Daniel 12 or Psalm 16 or Psalm 41, other Psalms about the resurrection that are much clearer. But he takes this obscure passage and uses the tense of the sentence to make his point. Who in the world would have chosen that passage to make a point about the resurrection? But he does it because he knows their affinity for the Pentateuch, the first 5 books, so he uses Exodus to do it. And it makes perfect sense when you think about it, and they had nothing to say in response because once again, Jesus turned the tables. This whole chapter started with them questioning his authority, and by the time this chapter is over, they have no question now. Who has the true authority? Jesus exposed the questioners behind the question. But they actually take one more shot, and because we're running low on time here, I'll do this very quickly. Luke doesn't actually record this, probably because it's a similar teaching to what happened back in Luke chapter 10. The Sadducees are silenced, but the Pharisees want one more shot. And they ask him, out of the 613 laws, which command is the greatest? And this was debated among the Jews. First of all, how do we rank God's laws? And should we even rank God's laws? So they're going to trap Jesus to see, number one, how he ranks God's law, and if he's going to make a fool of himself by his answer. And they're going to see whether or not he even endeavors to rank them at all. Because that might lead to the suggestion that some of God's laws are more important than the others. And that's, preachers even today, we're afraid to do that too. We don't want to say one law is more important than the other. So you can see what a trap this is. But again, he's so brilliant. He picks one from Deuteronomy 6 and the other from Leviticus 19. Love God and love your neighbor as yourself. And absolutely nails it here. Because no matter which one of the other 611 laws you choose, they're going to fit under the category of loving God and loving your fellow man. And yes, Jesus did participate in ranking the laws. Why? Because if you don't love God or love your neighbor, our obedience to the rest of the commands don't really mean much. God is not interested in creating a people who simply follow his rules. He's a father looking for children who he can delight in, he can love, and that they can love and delight in him in return. And the question just to think about, and because we're out of time, we're not going to be able to answer this, but just think about that in your own life. What can get in the way of making the 2 greatest commands our top priority? keeping that in the forefront of our mind to love God and love our neighbor. Good thing to think about in our lives. Behind every question is a questioner. And it's a good thing to ask questions, but this chapter shows us it's not good to ask questions with wrong motives, like trying to prove ourselves right, or trying to make someone else look bad, or trying to get out of having to do something God tells us to do. Questions are rarely random, and we can ask questioners questions in return to help find out why they're asking and what's really going on. Sure hope that was helpful. We're going to take a break now. If you'll remember to read through pages 145a and the corresponding scriptures for Wednesday night, we'll take a break and we'll be back for our praise and preaching service at 10:45. Thanks again for all of your good participation through text message. That was just really helpful. And you guys nailed that question I thought was too difficult. Nothing's too difficult for you guys. You're the best. I'll see you all in 15.